Well, hello to everyone. I'd like to welcome you to another Fireside Adoptees interview. We have a special guest today, which is Cassandra Adams, a wonderful person from the donor-conceived community with a really impressive biography. She's a transethnic, late discovery sperm donor-conceived person. She's dedicated to raising awareness of issues surrounding donor conception. Focus includes educating parents on best practices, advancing legislative changes for reforming for the fertility industry, writing, speaking, and other creative outlets. And she explores the ethics of donor conception, the emotional impact and trauma of being a late discovery donor-conceived person herself, the complexities of ethnicity discoveries. And she's a very engaged person in the donor-conceived community and someone who is actively engaging with adoptees on a regular basis. So we're really happy to welcome her here. And Cassandra, I thank you so much for joining today and making time for us.
Thank you so much for having me, and thank you for this space and for being such a great host.
Really appreciate it. I've had the great fortune of being able to meet you in person and spend some time with you one-on-one. That was a really wonderful exchange. It opened up so many things in my mind, so many questions I had about your experience as a donor-conceived person. And so I was excited to arrange this. I know we've been going back and forth for a number of months about actually pulling this interview off. So thank you again for that. I wanted to just jump right in. I have a lot of questions for you, but first of all, the importance of the story. Can you please tell us your story as a donor-conceived person, when and how you found out you were donor-conceived?
Yeah, so I am coming up on my 5th rebirth day, as we call them, in just a week. So I 5 years ago, in August of 2017, I took a recreational at-home DNA test, 23andMe, as part of a research study. But I was also very interested in doing this, and I was always very interested in ancestry and genealogy and things like that. And when I got my results on September 26th of 2017, there was immediate red flags that something was not as I had expected. So the family I grew up in, I grew up with two parents, a mother and a father. My mother is first generation Italian American. She was conceived in Italy and born here. Her parents were cousins from the same small town. I very much knew that side. And my dad was very, very American. I had done his tree with the help of one of his cousins, and it was very, New England colonial settlers, New Amsterdam colonial settlers and things like that. And so I was actually kind of more interested in seeing like the pie chart breakdown of his side, because it was so mixed and so many generations in America. But when I got my results, what I saw was pretty much 50% what would be consistent with Southern Italy, and 50% Ashkenazi Jewish. So it was immediately interesting.
Yes,
and of course for several hours I really tried to piece it together, as far as, well, maybe my dad, somebody in his family with a German last name was really Jewish, and maybe my Italian grandfather was really Jewish, and together that added up to 50%. But over the course of several hours, overnight, actually, when I was looking at these results, I realized that this was not making sense, and that there was really only one answer, which was that my dad was not my biological father. And I confronted my mother in the morning, and she confirmed that, and she confirmed that they had to use a sperm donor because of infertility from my dad who raised me.
Can you describe what the feeling was like hearing that from her?
Oh, it was like my entire world came crumbling down. Your identity. I mean, it really feels like a building collapse and in your body. And it was like the cracks had been growing and growing overnight as I had been coming to the conclusion that this was probably what it was. And I wasn't even sure about why my dad wasn't my dad, but I was coming to that conclusion. And it's just a collapse of your identity. You have no idea who inhabits your body, and it feels like you're in a stranger's body, which I'm sure is a feeling all of you.
Yeah, and
But
especially
it's that sudden crash, though, when it's a discovery like that, and having my mom tell me, for a fact, confirmed that shaky ground that I was on, and it just everything just I had no idea what could have happened, or who I was, or what I had passed down to my daughter.
And I'd like to talk with you in a little bit more about the parental side of what it's like when this is disclosed to people. Obviously, we have late discovery adoptees too, but you have the non-parent expected, or a lineage that was completely unexpected. And it must be something that the parent who has chosen not to disclose this has a lot of trepidation around. So I'd like to address that with you in a few minutes here, but I'm just wondering, it must have been so disorienting to feel like everything was torn up, as you said, or collapsed, imploded. And maybe in your mind, you think there must be a mistake, or before you had confirmed it with her, like I'm interpreting something incorrectly that's in front of me. But it just had to be so, I'm going to use the word traumatic here, just something that changed your life forever, every bit of your being. And so I can only imagine what that was like for you.
It really was. It really was. It's a before and after moment. And I think we all have a lot of before and after moments in our lives, but this takes the cake. I mean, this has changed my life more than just about anything else that's ever, more than anything else that's ever happened to me. Even becoming a parent myself, even though that may have changed the kind of day-to-day routines more, but I feel like this discovery has changed me more as a human being, and had more of an impact on just my identity and the course of my life. This is a bigger before and after than anything else that's ever happened to me.
And certainly adoptees can relate to the identity question and issue here, and late discovery. Maybe even if you're not a late discovery, the issues that come up with for us about who we are and our significance and our position in these families that we grow up in. I'm wondering, so are there popular societal views on donor conception that you encounter?
Yes, there are. So there is 100% the rainbows and unicorns narrative around donor conception, as well as there is with adoption, particularly with single parents by choice. The idea that you can become a parent on your own, and that is considered really progressive and really fabulous, and go for it, and you can do this, and empowering. And so it tends to have that kind of connotation behind it, that if you're going to a sperm bank and you're using donor conception, that's a really brave move, and that's really you're going for it, and you really want it, and you really want this child. And that's kind of the narrative that we're given from an early age, is that your parents went through so much to have you, and so you were really, really wanted. That's kind of the first thing that a lot of people say when they hear that you were conceived from a sperm or egg or embryo donor. Wow, your parents really wanted you. Your so it gets to be a lot. And of course, at the very beginning, when people were saying this to me, it hadn't really quite sunk in how much, because I was getting that message from my mom, as you were just saying, the trauma that your parents go through, especially 40 years ago, 40 plus years ago now, I guess, when I was conceived, the trauma that parents went through, to have what was still at that time a very secretive procedure, that that there was a great sacrifice on their part, and it was very brave of them to go through this. And
That's relatable. That's very relatable for, and as you know, it's something very similar to what we hear. We find that people have surprisingly strong, but not so well-informed views that they're willing to voice on, at least on adoption. It sounds like you encounter something very similar in your community as well.
It's very similar. Yeah. I mean, some people just think it's a really cool story too. And I think a lot of younger donor conceived people kind of still carry that on. They think it's really cool that they have a really unique conception story, especially they may be the only one in their, especially kids who are told now, who are told early. And so they're able to talk about it in school, and their friends may know and stuff. And so they think about it as being a very special conception story that they have, because it's different from their friends, and that makes it very unique. And so that's kind of the idea that I think a lot of parents and that the fertility industry kind of pushes, is that it makes us special, it makes us unique, it's really cool, like it's a really neat story, like
yes,
yes,
you have a special origin story that you can. And I want to go into understanding about legality and ethics here. So are there any legal differences that apply to egg donors versus sperm donors? Or are they treated the same legally? Or?
Yeah, it's the same, I believe, legally. Whoever donates, which is kind of a misnomer, whoever's selling their sperm or their eggs would sign something which kind of effectively, takes away their parental rights from any resulting children born. So neither one would have legal rights over any resulting children. And especially with egg donation, generally, unless there's also surrogacy involved, generally someone who's having an egg donor conceived child would also be birthing the child themselves. And I believe that the kind of legal terminology is still based on the idea that if someone actually witnesses the child being birthed from a person, that person is the legal mother, in most cases. And that's so even if there was an egg donor involved, the person giving birth would be the legal parent there. And then, generally that if assuming a heterosexual couple, the person's husband would be automatically the legal father, which I think was what happened a lot in our cases a few decades ago, was that because our mothers were married to their husbands, that the husband would automatically be the father, and the doctors were very hush hush about it, and everybody knew, but nobody would say anything. That way nobody was messing up the birth certificate document, which would say that this child born is the child of these two people.
Yeah, that's one of the questions I have for you, actually, is on birth certificates, which are such a big thing for us. Also issues of anonymity and privacy. I know that probably generates a lot of feelings in you. Can you talk a little bit about how you feel about the positions that people are seeking? I was just donating and looking to remain anonymous. How does that make you feel?
The idea of anonymity, first of all.
Yes.
I mean, I cannot thank DNA testing enough for making anonymity obsolete, because it's dead, and any clinic that tries to tell someone otherwise is unfairly treating the person supplying their gametes too. It's absolutely not fair to donors to promise them any kind of anonymity now in 2022, but of course it still happens. However, there are many banks that do offer something called open ID, or some of them call it known, but it's not really known. They have different terminology for it. I forget what they're moving towards, but open ID, which is generally open at 18. And it depends on the bank what that actually means. It may mean that you get a letter from the donor, or it may mean that through the clinic, you can email the clinic and they will pass that email on to the donor, and then you get one response back. And but there's never a guarantee when you're saying, okay, 18 years down the line, we promise you some type of contact with this person.
Right.
There's not a guarantee the person will still be alive. There's not a guarantee that they'll be able to find the person, because we know that a lot of donors are not updating banks with their updated addresses and emails and contact information. And there's not a guarantee that that person will not have changed their mind and will not welcome contact, and maybe we'll shoot off an email saying, okay, here's a couple answers to your questions, but I don't want any further contact. So a lot of parents sign up for that thinking that that's better than totally anonymous, which it is, but it's nowhere near what a lot of adult donor conceived people would want from the person who makes up half of who we are. So to say it's really not anonymous anymore is just the key takeaway, but also the fact that the banks need to stop pushing for totally anonymous, and they even have to stop pushing for this open at 18, because a lot of parents now are DNA testing their children and finding the donor earlier than 18 anyway, and donors need to really be prepared for that. And with the kind of ethical considerations too, there's the idea of, what do you owe somebody who you've given life to?
Right.
And that's a very ethically fraught questions. We've gone to see, we've had a lot of conferences with various bioethicists and philosophers just kind of postulating on these questions, and of course it's all just theoretical, but for us, it feels that if you are consenting to do this, you are doing this for the sole purpose of bringing bringing many children into the world.
Right.
That if you bring someone into the world, you have the ethical responsibility to, at minimum, keep us updated with health updates, and at least give us an idea of who you are, and at least maybe meet us one time, if nothing else. But we feel like there's a lot more. Of course, it varies for every donor conceived person what they want out of that relationship too.
Sure.
They may not want a relationship at all either, but ethically, we at least feel that we are owed updated medical history and answers to any questions that we may have.
I'm glad you raised the question, or the comments that you've had about medical history, because that is, along with birth certificates, one of the big things for adoptees that is so impactful, medical history. And I know for you that, I wonder if you could speak, if you feel open to talk a little bit about what that has been like for you, because I know that's a big issue.
That's been huge for me. And I feel fortunate, because I know there are people who were affected even more so, but it's different when, I think, as you all know, if you tell a doctor that you don't know your medical history, versus if you're giving them false history enthusiastically as if it were the right history. So the most devastating instance for me, and there are several instances that are much smaller, like my dad who raised me has very bad rheumatoid arthritis, so anytime I would have anything, I'd get my rheumatoid factor tested, and it turns out but that's a little bit of a smaller issue. But the main thing for me is that, so my dad who raised me has a lot of mental health problems, and it turns out my biological father has some mental health history there as well, both with depression, anxiety, kind of some bipolar tendencies in both these men, which is, wow, look, they match them so perfectly, right? But but not intentionally. But so when I was a teenager and I started struggling with very severe depression and anxiety, And by the time I got into a psychiatrist when I was 15 years old, and I remember the exact scene where I was. It was one of those things that's very much imprinted. I can picture where I was. I can picture where everyone was sitting. And the doctor asked my parents after my session, had my parents come in and ask them if there were what the history of mental health struggles were in their families. And my mom has a lot of anxiety on her side. So she said that. And then my dad spoke, and not only did he talk about his mental health struggles, but he talked about his mother's and all these things that I hadn't quite known about his family and how extensive it was. And then, he told the psychiatrist that he was on medication for his mental health problems. And the doctor asked him what medications he was on, and ended up treating my depression based on the medications that worked for my raising dad, which meant that he was trying, and my dad had gone through a lot of medications, trial and error, things like that. So the psychiatrist actually started out with medications that might not have been a first line choice for most people, most teenagers, just because those worked on my dad. And I actually remember, I had this memory come back because I had a friend of mine who's excellent on TikTok. I've kind of reached the age where I'm like not so great at TikTok, but a friend of mine whose name is Laura who's a comic, who actually just recently did a skit for me about this scene in my life. And so the memory kind of came back to me that the doctor even told me, as these medications were not working for me, he actually said to me, normally I would take you off of this and try something else, but because it worked for your dad, I'm going to keep you on it a little bit longer to see if maybe it'll have an effect, and this happened with multiple medications to the point where I was out of school for like the second half of my sophomore year of high school. There were self-injury attempts. There was a, suicide attempt. There was a lot of worsening of my condition during the time where we were trying to find medications that worked. And of course, it's not a foolproof system. I'm sure even if the doctor hadn't based it on my dad's history, there would have been some trial and error. But the fact that it was so targeted toward everything that worked for my dad, that it took the doctor a lot longer to try anything else other than, and even the doctor even tried some extremely strong medications before even trying another antidepressant. Some very, very strong, heavy duty medications because they worked on my dad. So I ended up having some very, very strong medications given to me that didn't even work because, So and to know that I went so far downhill, that had my attempt been successful at that point, that played into it. I spent a lot of time. That memory came back to me a lot, and I had to process that a lot in therapy because there was no getting over that. All the understanding of why my parents had not told me the truth and trying to put myself in their position, trying to understand, it still doesn't take away the hurt and the betrayal from a moment like that.
They effectively sent you down a path they knew was not warranted for that type of treatment. And didn't give any indication to you or the doctors that there was no biological connection there. And they knew that, but that's really tough.
And this happens for hundreds and dozens and thousands of donor conceived people, where both parents know that the child is donor conceived, and then both parents are actively lying to doctors in very crucial circumstances at times, and it's not okay.
It's not okay, and we do experience it as well, as you know. And of course, I won't share stories of other adoptees who have confided in me about that, but I know of people who have gone through something similar as well. But to have it, I think you said enthusiastically or something, just presented so matter-of-factly to to the attending psychiatrist or doctor that, like it was your history. I can see how that must have impacted you in so many ways, thinking that through and the implications of that for you. And it leads right into some of these questions I have about what I'm going to call secrets, lies, late discoveries. And of course, these are loaded words in a way, but they really do play into the types of stories that you're telling us here. Is that a widespread thing as far as you can tell in the donor conceived community?
Yeah, it's very widespread. Most donor conceived people are finding out at a later age from DNA testing, or some parents are feeling the heat right now. And I know a lot of parents that are telling their adult children now, because they see stories like mine in the media, and they're getting scared that their kids will take a DNA test. So they're telling them now. But by far, the majority of donor conceived people above the age of 25, 30 are late discovery. It's a minority of people that are told as children in my generation, and even into the 2000s. There have been and still are doctors who are telling parents to keep it a total secret and pretend it never happened.
Wow.
So that's like still happening. I mean, I know it still happens in adoption also, but like it's rampant. It's really insane. And it's easier with donor conception because there are pregnancy photos. So a lot of parents feel like they can hide it better. So yeah, it's crazy. It's adding to just this insane amount of trauma. And in the support groups, it's like day after day of people coming in and saying, I just found out, my parents just told me, I just took a DNA test, just over and over. It's a lot.
When you mentioned the maternity pictures, let's say pictures of pregnant people, that really resonated with some of the stories I've been hearing lately from people who had been presented narratives their whole lives, and it asked questions in the adoptee community. Where's the picture of you when you're pregnant with me? Oh, someone said their parents told them it was lost in a flood. There was a flood in the basement, and therefore we don't have it. So I know that sort of thing is very problematic. It's certainly the case that late discovery adoptees are experiencing something very similar in terms of this traumatic upheaval. It's always, for me, been difficult to digest being adopted, but I know for people who have built decades and decades of their lives and the stories they know and the histories, and suddenly, no, that wasn't the case, and nobody had the intention to tell you, unless you had investigated yourself or done something like what you did. And so this is why I'm just wondering about the fact that you're not told, but what sort of things do parents tell donor conceived children once it's out in the open? What sort of things do they tell them about why they went this path? Or
yeah, so the biggest thing that seems to be the kind of which I know you will all relate to, is that it's very upsetting for our parents, and we have to console them while they're crying and all these things because it was very traumatic for them.
yeah,
and so the explanations also generally center around them. We wanted a baby. We wanted a baby. We didn't think you'd ever find out. And then my dad, who is quite a person, would tell me it wasn't a lie because you weren't supposed to find out. So it just wasn't a lie at all.
yes.
And, yeah. So the reasoning that my mom kind of gave is that, they were given three options when they were told about this, the infertility. They were told, you either don't have children, you do this procedure, or you adopt a child. And this was presented as a way for at least one of the parents to be related to the child. So, what a lot of us say now as adults, we're like, well, so you valued that genetic connection on some level because you thought it was better that one of you be related to the child. And yet you didn't value the connection when it's us looking for that other half,
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. And so, and also again, with donor conception at that time, I was conceived and born in 1982. With donor conception at that time, it was also presented whether it was said in those words or whether it was alluded to, but it was presented as a way to keep the husband's infertility out of the picture because it would look like nothing had ever happened. Nobody had to know about this procedure. My mom was never given any paperwork. There was nothing written in her chart as far as she knows.
Wow.
It was extremely secretive through the 1980s even, where there would be no record that it had ever occurred. And so there was no way for the kid to find out. There was no way for the doctors to ever link whichever donor had donated with whatever child had been born. And so that seemed like a great option to a lot of couples because they could continue pretending as if there had been no fertility issues. They could pretend that it was their child. Nobody would ask questions. One of them would be related to the child. So, maybe that would help as far as if the child looked like the one parent, at least that would be easier to hide. And then they got to, just kind of pretend it was their own baby, both of them. And, they didn't have to worry about the costs of adoption. And this was extremely inexpensive at the time. We get some people in genealogy groups sometimes who find they have a non-paternity event of some sort, and they're, in their 50s, 60s, and they're like, no, my parents could not have afforded that. That didn't even exist back then. Well, I'm sorry, it existed in the 1800s, and it was pretty inexpensive for obviously if you're, starving and living paycheck to paycheck, but it was very, very affordable back then because a lot of doctors were just kind of doing it as this kind of secret procedure. It was not. Now what's happening now with the fertility industry is it's a big for-profit dollar industry. So prices are very elevated and stuff. But back then it was a much more affordable route to go than adoption as well. And then you'd get your baby and there would be no other parents in the picture because it was all anonymous. And yeah, so those were the reasons given to me for why they went that route, because they wanted a baby very badly and all of those reasons. And then the reasons that they kept it a secret were also some of those reasons, and that, not to embarrass the father, that they didn't think we ever needed to know, that the doctor assured them that, that we would never know, that, that if they went home and had sex afterwards, that maybe it could still be my dad's baby. So why even bother telling? Because
wow.
I mean, there were lots of things, and then lots of, well, I wanted to tell you, but daddy didn't want to, or I never wanted to tell you, and I was going to put it in my will. I mean, the stories just kept changing. Or I would have told you, but then when you were depressed as a teenager, we didn't want to upset you more. And it's like, oh my gosh, like the excuses keep changing because there was really never this intention to ever think or talk about it again. So it's just the self-centered excuses just keep piling on, and it's very difficult to talk to our parents about this because it's been something that they've had in their back of their minds for 40 years, and they're not willing to bring it up again without getting very defensive, getting very re-traumatized by the whole experience. And we end up bearing the brunt of that.
That leads directly into the next subject I have here, which is invalidation. Sometimes we experience invalidation from other adoptees. Does anything like that happen in the donor conceived community?
Yeah, there very much does. There are many donor conceived people who don't have an interest to find, just as there are some adoptees who don't have an interest to find their biological family. And so a lot of them, again, will do the whole, you're all being very negative, or you only feel this way because you found out late in life. And again, I'm sure as we know from adoption, yes, telling from the beginning is better than finding out when you're 35, 40, 50. Of course, it eliminates that discovery trauma, but it does not eliminate everything. It does not eliminate all the problems that can result from this. But we do get a lot of donor conceived people who are like, well, we need to tell both sides. You know, the issue is then they're often doing this to parents. They're often telling prospective parents like, oh, don't worry, I have no interest in the donor, so don't worry, go ahead with whatever your plan is. And it's, of course, hearing all sides is an important thing, and it sounds really great when they're presenting it, like, no, you need to hear all sides from all views from donor conceived people. But when it goes towards giving parents advice that just isn't helpful for the community, it actually ends up doing a lot of harm, because a lot of parents will then take that as their reason to do something that may not be best for their future child, where they could have taken a step in another direction and done something a little bit better. But the hope is from a lot of prospective parents that their child doesn't care and their child does not want to ever find the donor parent. That's what a lot of parents hope for. And so there are a lot of often younger donor conceived people who play into that.
Sure.
You know, haven't come out of the fog, so to speak. So yeah, it's frustrating. It's very hard. And there's a lot of invalidation out there from the public and from parents.
Right. Yeah, and I find that my observations are there's a narrative that, unfortunately, the popular narrative that gets supported when certain voices are elevated in the adoptee community at the expense of others. If the experience of adoption, nobody wants anyone to have a quote unquote bad adoption experience, but let's say you do, and a lot of people do. To not be able to express what that's like and have instead the popular narrative of everything's fine, I didn't have any trauma or trauma response to what happened, there's no problem, this was better for me, cements in place the social narrative and perpetuates it generation after generation that this is fine, this is okay, there's nothing that needs to be addressed or reformed. And so we get stuck. And I think that that's finally starting to break up a little bit in terms of people are hearing adoptee voices in our case, and starting to listen to hear what the experience is like for far too many people, and say, unfortunately, it's not all, like you said, rainbows and unicorns. There's something to be said here. And similarly, I hear what you're saying, that probably that serves the same purpose, is that there are certain voices that will keep the narrative in place and keep certain forms of progress from happening. And it's unfortunate because, like I said, nobody wants anybody to have a bad adoption experience. Even the word experience is kind of problematic for me, because it sounds like going to an amusement park or something, or on a vacation. What was it like for you? And it's your life you're talking about, or the life of a human being. So it's really not an experience in that sense. It's not like a ride you were on. I'm wondering though, so in terms of the sorts of things that I think probably are similar also for adoptees, is you have, and this goes right into this ethical implications piece here, search and reunion DNA siblings, seeing all the things that you mentioned, Laura, and the sibling pods that I'm seeing and things on TikTok and Instagram, and it just blows my mind up here, the implications ethically for what's going on. Could you talk a little bit about those things?
Yeah, so that is one of the unique aspects of donor conception. We kind of, as Cindy knows, I have this chart that I made, kind of, yes, this chart that I made of kind of the intersections between the different groups of people who, for one reason or another, don't know one or both sides of their parentage. So this particular aspect of it is something that's like pretty unique to donor conceived people. Of course, adoptees and anybody with any kind of unknown paternity can have tons of siblings, yes. But the unique thing with donor conception is that the numbers tend to be getting towards astronomical at this point. So when I was conceived using fresh sperm. So that's one of our taglines when we talk to other donor conceived people. It's like, hey, were you fresh or frozen? You know, it's like one of your like, hey, how you doing? Like things you can only say to another donor conceived person, you know? So I was conceived via fresh sperm in 1982, which means that my biological father gave his sample in a cup, and that cup was taken right to where my mom was, and my mom was inseminated with the contents of that cup. And so it was fresh, you know, the doctor drove it like a half an hour. And so that's all the time that elapsed. Once HIV and AIDS became I don't say the word pandemic, right? An epidemic in the early to mid 80s, and they realized that it was spread also through bodily fluids like semen. That is when freezing of sperm became the norm. It was done prior to, you know, it was done in the 70s. I know people who in the 70s who were conceived via frozen sperm. It wasn't impossible, but banking of sperm became a huge thing in the mid 80s and beyond, because they had to quarantine the samples to test for HIV, I think 6 months later or something, to make sure that they weren't passed, because there were groups of women in various countries who contracted HIV from using donor sperm. And so with the freezing of sperm came the rise of larger sperm banks and kind of profiting off of this, because it could be stored and therefore it was available for ordering and things like that. And also with the freezing of sperm, what happens now is that samples are split. So, you know, in my case, where whatever my biological father produced and what was inseminated, you know, into my mother, nowadays, whatever is produced from one ejaculate sample is washed or with some kind of solution and split into various straws, they call them, and frozen. If you've ever seen like those kind of cryobank cylinders that they've had in television shows, they're like cylinders, and then they've got like little straws kind of in there frozen, and that's frozen sperm. And that's because I don't remember the figure of how many sperm are released during each amount of but because there's enough that so one sample can, you know, be used on, you know, 8 different women, 8 different people to conceive multiple children. So the amount of children that can be conceived when there's frozen sperm is a lot higher than it was with fresh samples. And even those of us with fresh samples, a lot of us are getting into the, you know, double digits, you know, 10, 20, 30 siblings. But kids nowadays who were conceived via the large cryobanks, having a sibling pod of over 100 is not unusual. You know, I've had parents say that they have the sperminator. Yeah, I've had parents say that they know their kid has, you know, like 200 siblings, and they're possibly all over the United States, all over Canada and Australia, because the banks ship to various countries. And there are no limits as to how many children can be produced from each donor. And because there is still a lot of secrecy in donor conception, a lot of these kids may still not know that they're donor conceived. They don't realize how many siblings they have. Their parents may not realize how many siblings they have. And it's a lot. If you can imagine, and I'm sure a lot of you have met new siblings, right? And how much energy, emotional energy that goes into that. I mean, it's exhausting. So I have, right now, there's 4 of us from my biological father's donations. And then he has 3 children that he raised, right? And so one of his children that he raised doesn't want anything to do with us. So that's one person I don't, and one of my donor siblings has not responded, doesn't believe it, whatever. So that's 2 of my donor siblings and 2 of his raised children that I have a relationship with. So it's only 5 of us, right? And that, like, the amount of like whatever that we go through just to like come up with a date to like meet up. Like, you know, we can't find a date for all 5 of us to meet up. That's only 5 of us. And the amount of energy that goes into getting to know this new person, getting to know their families, getting to know their stories of how they found out, because often it's very traumatic how they found out. And kind of walking them through that and tell them my story. And it's exhausting. And then the whole, you know, the fear of rejection and the fear of saying something wrong and all these things that go into it. This is just with siblings. This is not even with biological parent. So when you put something like this into the dozens, and each one of those dozens of siblings is possibly dealing with this huge identity crisis in their middle, you know, as a middle-aged person, or dealing with it, you know, with this discovery when they have their own small children. It's like it's insane, and it's so much. And I mean, if any of you watched the documentary Our Father on Netflix, if you haven't, watch it. Jacoba is a great friend of mine, the woman who's profiled in the show, and they are into the 90s, and all of that is fresh sperm. And there's another kicker on top of it, which that their parents' fertility doctor is their biological father, so he was using his own sperm on all, but which is an added layer that many donor conceived people have dealt with. So, but to go back to your point about siblings, it's just, it's not emotionally or physically like feasible, you know, to maintain relationships with this many people. And it's honestly, it's not fair for the donor either. I mean, granted, their actions precipitated this, so our empathy for them is a little not as great as it might have been otherwise. Right, like they got themselves into this situation, you know. But when you think about it, it's like, really, they weren't told that they were going to have to deal with possibly 200 kids someday, you know. And for the stand-up people who are willing to get to know them, I mean, that's insanity to ask for the kind of emotional openness and sharing with that kind of family numbers. So it's such a huge problem in our community, and it's only going to get worse in the coming years as the kids conceived with some of those large numbers are getting older. It's just they're gonna start to speak up about it and about how crazy it is, and it's a lot.
There's so many questions I'm not able to get to. I'd love to connect again sometime if we can arrange another interview. But what I wanted to ask you is specifically, we're in the age of allyship, alliances, and there are some overlaps between the adoptee community and the donor conceived community that I've found you to be very articulate in being able to express. Would you, for the benefit of the people listening to the interview, talk a little bit about what you see as the overlaps between these two communities?
Yeah, so the biggest one that I have been appreciative of so much, seeing it, because we didn't really have the words to articulate this. Thank you, Cindy. Is the commodification aspect. That is
Mhm.
something where, because a lot of late discovery donor conceived people, which is most of us at this stage, you know, anybody younger than maybe 25, maybe knew from a little bit younger, maybe. But those of us older than that, we're finding out now. A lot of us end up in general NPE groups, or not parent expected groups. So we're finding ourselves in groups with a lot of people who are conceived via affairs and things like that, predominantly. And being that those were some of the first places that some of us find ourselves in, to find the adoptee community and realize that this issue of commodification was something we had in common, was a great relief to me and a great relief to a lot of other donor conceived people, because we would get some of the same kind of tropes with some people who were general NPEs, like, well, your parents really wanted you, or wow, that's really cool that you have a lot of siblings, you know, things like that, where when we would go to adoptees and talk about that, there would be an immediate understanding with, oh my gosh, my parents paid this much money for the sperm, or my parents, you know, said that they wanted me so much, and but that makes me feel like crap, or the fact that all these parents, you know, intended parents, keep calling us gifts over and over again, and that makes me feel sick to my stomach, and I'm not a gift, and I'm not a donation, and all these things. And those were things that a lot of people couldn't understand, even if they could understand the identity upheaval and the kind of late discovery trauma of feeling like you had been lied to. Was this issue of commodification. So that is something where I appreciate the adoptee community so much, because you have spent time putting that into words, why it feels so crappy to have a dollar sign associated with your birth, why it feels so crappy to have people thinking of you as the goal of their treatment, and then you have to live up to this standard, or you have to be you're kind of the property, you know, like we have a lot of parents will get very agitated if you mention anything about the donor being any type of parent or importance, and they freak out, and you can see the ownership, the possessiveness of, no, this is my child, you know, and you can almost feel it through the screen, and it's scary. And then you realize, like, oh my gosh, that's what adoptive parents can be like as well, where there's this element of, I paid for this, or I went through X, Y, and Z years of infertility, or X, Y, and Z fertility treatments, and now I have you, and you're my goal, and you're my gift. And yet the gift comes at the cost of losing part or all of your identity. That's the issue of having that tied in with money is extremely disturbing, and is something that adoptees can very much understand, and is what I'm most grateful for in finding the adoptee community, is finding that similarity, the intentionality of it too. Whereas a lot of times with other cases, there may be you know, uncertainty about who was the parent, uncertainty about who was the father. There may be cases where, you know, one or both, or a parent, you know, left unexpectedly, and those are really, really unfortunate, sad circumstances. But the thing with donor conception and adoption is kind of the intentionality that goes into planning to either adopt a child or conceive a child with donor conception, is that you're intentionally planning for that disconnect with one or both sides of the family. And that's often what hurts a lot, is because the parents planned it, and so they get very defensive about the fact of why they did that, and don't really understand what our side of the loss is. Those are some of the biggest similarities that I see with with adoption. And then of course now some of the biggest things coming up in the donor conception world are things like embryo donation or adoption, whatever some people prefer, various terminology, but couples who are doing in vitro fertilization, even with their own sperm and eggs, may have leftover embryos. And there's a big movement and a big push kind of correlated with the kind of national politics that we see to consider those embryos to be people. And some parents are understandably very hesitant to have their embryos destroyed. And of course you can understand that it's painful for them, and but they would rather give them to strangers to raise than have them destroyed. And so that's been a big thing that we've been seeing a lot in our groups now, is people who are either one or both partners are infertile, and they're seeing embryo adoption as a way to save poor frozen babies from being defrauded.
Wow.
So yeah, so and that's a huge correlation with adoption there, because those children will likely have full siblings being raised by their biological parents, and then are being raised by a family that is not genetically related to them at all. So the main difference would be that they would be gestated by their raising mother, so there wouldn't be that disconnect at birth, which is also something that a lot of sperm donor conceived people don't generally deal with either, is that separation from the birthing parent. But yeah, so embryo donation, adoptees are going to be like huge in the coming 10, 20 years. And it's going to be
informative. Yeah.
painful to hear what their stories are going to be like.
And these, of course, are the sorts of things that I was so eager to get you to speak about to us as adoptees, and also to anyone who will listen to the interview on YouTube when it's up. I can't thank you enough for your openness and transparency and time. I know that these are big issues. They're big for us. It's been very edifying to hear about. And I don't mean like a rewarding, enriching experience in terms of positive. So obviously there's a lot of very heavy things going on here. I just mean that there's a bond, I think, that we can feel between members of our communities that I certainly have come to appreciate with the limited exposure I've had to it. I just wanted to thank you again for being such a strong voice and for being present for a lot of the discussions that are happening that you do see on Facebook sometimes with adoptees, and the support you give for us. So I know we're all friends on Facebook with a lot of people.
Yeah, I appreciate all of the work that all of you do in educating, because it is so necessary. And so many of the questions that we have as donor conceived people are things that adoptees have touched on. And it's empowering to know that there can be changes that can come about if you push. And
yeah.
Oh yeah, and it's hard. Well, that's another aspect as well that why I wanted to get into speaking more with adoptees too, is because, as people raised in this society, a lot of donor conceived people would go into telling parents dealing with infertility, like, well, you can adopt too, and I didn't want to be a party to that just adopt slogan, because then that's putting the burden on a whole nother group of people, marginalized people, to do the work there. So I wanted to do the work myself so that I could give an informed opinion to parents in donor conception groups about what they're doing to build their families, you know, to make, because many of them do want to do things more ethically. And in considering whether they want donor conception or adoption and stuff, they're trying to find the more ethical choice. And, you know, I didn't want to be like, oh, well, you can choose that because that's ethical. No, I wanted to be educated on all aspects so that I could give an informed opinion to parents about what's ethical and what's not when you're talking about bringing children into the world and into your family.
Thank you so much. So what I'd like to do is conclude the recording piece of the interview. And at this point, I want to thank everybody for joining and point you to the Fireside Adoptees YouTube channel, where you'll find a number of interviews. And as we branch out into members beyond even the adoption constellation here, we're just appreciative of your support. We will, at the conclusion here, we'll start to address some things in the chat that were raised and open up for internal questions here. Thank you again, Cassandra, and we hope to speak to you again.
Thank
So
you
you'll
so
hear
much.
the recording stop now.